see and hear me? Yes. Okay, good. All right. So what I have here today is a setup of different water-based media, and I know acrylic is also water-based media, but it really does have its own binder in it that allows it to be put on canvas or wood, where the other water media like gouache and watercolor and ink, they do not. And so normally when you work with ink and gouache and watercolor, you're meant to work on watercolor paper. And there's several different types of watercolor papers that are out there. But watercolor paper usually is made of cotton versus paper pulp, which is usually trees. And so the cotton allows it to expand and it doesn't start to disintegrate or fall apart like you get with normal like drawing paper or things like that. So it is important to use watercolor paper or a mixed media paper that allows you to put water media on it so that it can stain and also so that it will last. So I have a setup of some gouache paints. Now gouache is a little bit different. This is one of my favorite brands, Winsor & Newton. It's a opaque watercolor that has chalk added to it. So you get all the benefits of working with watercolor. You can use these wet out of the tube, but you do need to add water to it because it is really brittle. So you can see I put some in this empty egg carton, and you can see how it's kind of cracking, but it reactivates when you wet it, just like watercolor. And so I like to buy the tubes of these because sometimes when they're wet, they're even more fun to play with. But I put these out yesterday and just let them dry so I could show you. You could work with them that way or not. Then I also have some watercolor here. This is a set that I purchased online around Christmas last year, and I've really enjoyed working with it. It pops out kind of like a Swiss Army knife or something. It's just got all these really cool colors. It's over 42 colors, and it came with these little water fillable brushes, and the water actually comes out of the pen into the brush. And so I'll show you how to use those and the traditional brushes in a moment. This was, I think, about $15 on Amazon, where of course you can find less expensive watercolors. Like this is a Crayola one, and it comes with a brush, and the colors are still very, very vibrant. But usually when you see more expensive watercolors, the pigment may be different. And so these said like fade resistant and archival, where I don't know if like the kids watercolor sets will all do that. I've used some kids or studio like level watercolor before, and within a year the colors had faded like significantly, almost to where they look like pastel. And so sometimes with watercolors and water media, you do get what you pay for, but it's still, most of these things are not too terribly expensive. So this may be under $5, where this was like 15, and but it is worth it if it's going to last a lot longer. And then this is the same brand as the gouache. This is a watercolor set of the tube watercolors by Winsor & Newton. And I like to use these together because the watercolor is transparent where the gouache is opaque. And so a lot of interior designers, fashion designers, they also use them together because they have opaque colors to represent fabrics and textiles and things that would be opaque. And then they have the transparent colors for sheer fabrics, glass, things like that that are going to be more transparent. So they work really well together. And so don't be afraid to mix them or use them on the same piece even. Okay, but these you can also work with while they're wet, or this set that I got, it actually came with 2 palettes, and so you can squirt these out, let them dry, mix them together, and then you can always go back and activate with water or squirt some more paint out if you want to. So they're all kind of fun to use. Now, as I said, you're supposed to use these on paper only, and so that can be hard for some people that want to work on canvas or not. So I know I like to create similar effects in my paintings where the paint flows together. And I've tried different attempts to make that work. Some successful, some not. One thing I have discovered are these acrylic inks, which they are really nice. They're acrylic-based inks, and they're fluid, so that you can do stuff on canvas with them, very similar to watercolor. However, they are still acrylic paint that have just been thinned down with different chemicals. So they don't have all the true properties of watercolor, but you can still do some pretty cool stuff. And you also don't have to worry about these fading over time. So that's one benefit of using those. But sometimes you just really want to use watercolor or gouache or whatever on canvas. And so I'm going to show you how you can do that. And Golden also makes these fluid flow acrylics, which are really nice. These are pretty expensive, and I use them up really quick. So a lot of the stuff that you see, I've accumulated over like 20 years. It's not stuff I just go buy, every day. And I remember this, it's like a set of 6 or 8. And I think I got it as like a Christmas present one year from another artist. And I thought that's really nice. I probably wouldn't have bought it because I think it was like $60 just for 6 tubes of this. So to me, that's pretty expensive. But I wanted you to see that there are other ways if you're wanting to work more fluid or like watercolor. There's acrylics that you can buy that are already like that, so you don't have to thin down your thicker paint. So if you want to work on canvas, if you have a prime canvas like they are at the store, and you just put watercolor on the surface, it is not going to stain it. And watercolor needs to absorb. That's why we usually use it on paper. And so if you put it on there, it will look like it dries. It may puddle for a little bit, but over time, it's just going to fall off. And if it gets wet, it's going to wipe away and things like that. So there are things you can put to your canvas that will allow you to use it like paper. And so I have 3 here, and yesterday I put several layers of each on this for you all so you could see what it looks like today. But this area here is what's called watercolor ground, and this is the brand is, I think it's Grumbacher. Oh, no, I guess I can't remember what the brand is. It's QOR watercolor, but I thought it was, anyway, that may be the brand. I got it at Hazel, but this one's called watercolor ground. With these, you really want to read the instructions every time, because with a lot of the acrylic paint, it's non-toxic, but with grounds are different from acrylic medium. So I know with the medium, I showed you like all those different things you could add to the paint. Those are all still plastic based, but these have chemicals in them that are not safe. Okay, so you always want to read them. Notice it even says it can cause cancer. Now that's usually like if you ingest it, or if you sand it and you breathe the powder. So if you just use it as instructed, you'll be fine. Okay, so but notice here it says let it dry 24 to 72 hours. So do most artists think that far in advance? No, but I did yesterday just for you all. But with these things, I got these 3 containers a couple of years ago, and when I got them, I just put it on like 10 canvases I had, so that they were all good to go whenever I wanted to work on them. So this is something you would have to do pretty far in advance. It also, most of them say put 2 to 3 coats on it, and I think that's so you can get rid of the texture of the canvas, and it actually has a surface for those pigments to absorb into. So if you look at this one up close, you'll see it's pretty smooth, and it almost looks like gesso, but it actually has more of a feel of paper. So that's the chemical part. I don't understand it all, but somehow they made a liquid paper that dries and and it's on there. This one's probably one of my favorites. It's called cold press ground, and it actually looks like paper pulp. And I took several paper making classes in graduate school, and we made our own paper, and it looks a lot like this when you let a lot of the water dry out. And this one, it doesn't have as many warnings, so I don't know if there's less chemicals in it or what, but it's really thick, almost like a really lightweight modeling paste. And when you put it on the surface and it dries, it really feels like, look at this. So this is a coarse watercolor paper. Do you see how they almost look the same? And so this really makes the surface feel more like watercolor paper, and it gives you that texture too that you see with a lot of watercolors. And touching it, it's been 24 hours, but it still feels a little sticky to me, I think, because it's been pretty humid. And then the least expensive, and this is a Golden brand product, and it's pretty universal. It's called Absorbent Ground. And this one is not only good for watercolor, gouache, but you can also draw with charcoal, colored pencils, things like that. So it literally turns your canvas into paper. And you can do a lot of really cool stuff with it. So this one I put 2 or 3 coats on, and you can see it almost looks like a piece of white drawing paper, right? So they all work very similar, but those are the things you can put on your canvases. Now I have seen at some higher end art stores, they will have canvases that are already treated for those, and it'll say like a watercolor canvas or watercolor board, and so they've already done that for you. So it just depends on where you shop, but I think most of these little jars, they were under $15 probably, I think, when I bought them, and I don't know how many paintings I've done from them. I mean, a lot, because you're putting on thin layers, and it's not something you use every day like your paint. But I'll come back and show you what it looks like on those in just a moment. So first I was going to just show you the gouache. I have a little canvas board that I taped a piece of watercolor paper down to. And with watercolor, but even though the paper is cotton, the paper will still want to buckle and bend when you're using it, because it gets wet and then dries and expands and then contracts. So I usually like to tape it down to kind of help control that a little bit. And then some people even go as far as they soak the paper and get it wet, and then they tape it down with this brown craft paper, and they let it then dry that way, and they call that like sizing or preparing it. But a lot of the watercolor artists I know, they don't they don't do that. Some paper you can buy, it's already been stretched like that for you. So it just depends. You can always also put it in a with a like t-shirt or something on top of it, and an iron on a low heat, and you could iron it flat too if you wanted to. But I would make sure there's no moisture if you do that. And any of these techniques that I'm showing you, once you're finished with the watercolor painting, I would take a clear coat varnish and spray the work, just because it is always going to be water soluble. So unless you're putting it behind glass in a frame, you probably would want to seal it in some way just to protect it from any moisture damage. Okay, so I set up a little still life over here with a shoebox with a pillowcase over it, and then just a little blue, cobalt blue glass. And I was just going to use that as like a little demo for today. I'm not going to paint the whole thing because I do have to watch my time. But I just wanted to show you kind of the difference between the watercolor and the gouache, and how those two look different. I also have different brushes here. These are all really soft. Usually with watercolor, you want to use softer brushes so that they don't leave streaks or scratch the paper. And so this is where, if you've had some that were almost too soft for the thick acrylic, they'll work perfect with watercolor. And I like to have like a really fine one for like really small details, larger ones for bigger areas, and then just a variety, to go back and forth with. But there's always these innovative people. These are brushes that I got online on Amazon. They're really inexpensive. They came in a pack, and then even some of the watercolors I got, they came with them. But these are brush pens that you can fill with liquid ink, or you can just put water in them and use them with watercolor. But they come in all different tips too. So you can see I have like a fine liner one here, a thicker pointed brush, kind of medium one, and then I have a flat one. And with these, you just squeeze them and water comes into the brush. So even if you're traveling and you can't really have a cup, you don't need one. You can just have some paper towel, and as you use it and you need to clean it, you can just squeeze it onto the paper towel, and that will kind of get the color off, put it on the paper towel, and then you can dip it into another color. So it's really, there's a lot of really cool things that are out there now. And so anyway, I'm going to show you how to use some of these. So what I plan on doing is doing part of this in watercolor and part in gouache, so you can kind of see the difference between the two. It may be kind of hard with my little tiny camera for you to get a clear picture of that, but I'll try to explain it as I'm working on it. So first, let's try the gouache side. So I'm using these gouache paints that I squirted out yesterday. So with this brush, I'm just squeezing. This is an ultramarine blue. And you can see really quickly, like just a little bit of water that I put in there, it activated that paint, and it's starting to become a liquid again. Just like watercolor, the more I brush on it and kind of dissolve that paint, the more thick it's going to be on the surface. And so for this glass, a large part of it, I see this color in it. So I'm just going to kind of block in some of these areas. And the cool thing about gouache is it dries really quickly, and then you can go back over it and add, like highlights and details on top of it. So let me show you this too. I'm going to just do it on this little piece of paper. That might be a better example. So this is the ultramarine gouache. You can see how opaque, how much more opaque it looks compared to watercolor. And then as I squeeze it and thin it out, creating washes, it becomes a little more transparent, but it's still pretty, like it's a lot more opaque and less spotty than you see with watercolor. And like I said, you can add even more color, and they get really, really rich. Like it almost looks like velvet on the surface when they dry. So that is the gouache. Now let me show you what that looks like with watercolor. So I don't have all these. These are labeled with numbers and letters, so it may not be quite the same color, but I think this one is close. We'll see. Maybe purple. And then, so this is, oh, it's ultramarine blue. So do you see that is me really brushing down hard, and you can see how it is a lot lighter. And also you can see the kind of spotty effect that you get with watercolor. And as I squeeze a little water into it, you can see how much more transparent the wash becomes with the watercolor. So still, beautiful, like they're both beautiful, but you can see how maybe this could represent like, some upholstery material on a couch, or this might look more like a, thin little sheer curtain or something. So they're fun to use together or, individually as well. So over here where I was working on this glass, I see a lot of different variation of different color blues and stuff. I'm just going to finish this area here. And if you like precision and being able to layer things, I think you would really like working with gouache, because you can get some really sharp, crisp lines and details. And it's also very forgiving because it's water soluble. You can always water it down and then start over and blot it off of the paper. All right, so I just painted the stem of the glass and the base of the glass. Now I'm going to switch brushes, and you can see I didn't even have to wash my brush. I just blot it on this paper towel and get the excess color off. So that's one really cool thing about these water brushes that have stuff inside of them. So now I'm going to take a bigger brush and then look at some of these areas close in this glass. So I see another blue, and you can really mix these colors quite a bit. So I'm adding some water to the white blush, and along the edge here I do see like some lighter values. I think I got a little too much water there. But usually when I'm working with watercolor and gouache, I'll work on like one side of the piece, and then I will let it dry while I go work on another side. And just kind of going back and forth a few minutes at a time, you're going to be able to have enough drying time. You can layer another color on top of it. However, if it is wet and you put another color on it, it's going to bleed like you saw earlier when I just did that. So we'll just put that there and let it dry for a few minutes. And so if you make a mistake, like I said, you can always go back and re-wet it and lift it up or dab it with a paper towel. So that's pretty fun that you have that option. You can also mix these. So like if I wanted a purple, I could take some of this ultimate blue and then just pick up some of this red. And sometimes I'll even use like a white ceramic plate or porcelain plate to squirt these on, because you can get little puddles of different colors and use it more like a traditional palette that you would use with acrylic or oil. So you can see this color now is a lot more purple. So it's really simple to blend the colors on the paper or in the palette. So I'll let that dry for a couple of seconds before I go back and do more. But I wanted to show you some other techniques with watercolor that you can do. Of course, this was all more dry brushing, like dipping into the paint and then putting it on the dry paper. But you can also do what's called wet on wet. And that's where you can really saturate the paper first. And this paper can hold a lot of water, so don't be scared that you're going to over saturate it. And I'm just going to take some more of this blue. Do you see how it kind of bleeds out? So you can get these really fluid ones, and if you leave that to dry, it will just continue to kind of bleed out and do some pretty fun stuff. And you can take other colors and incorporate into it. And then with those fluid inks, those you do not have to, you can just drop them onto the canvas directly or paint with them, because they are fluid. All right, and on the canvas, I'll show you how, let me get another small canvas. Okay, so this was a canvas from when we were doing those blending charts. So I wanted to show you. So if I put just watercolor on just bare canvas, do you see how it just stays on the surface because it can't absorb in? And it will dry, but it'll end up looking kind of speckly, and it won't be permanent on the surface. We're now on this board that I treated with these grounds. When I put the watercolor on there, do you see how it's absorbing into the surface right away? Or I'm sorry, this is the gouache, but it's just opaque watercolor. But you can see how much nicer that is versus it kind of puddling on the surface. And I can show you with watercolor too. So it even sounds like paper when I'm dragging my brush across it, but you see it absorbs right away. And so that's really one of the cool things about these absorbent grounds that you can buy. And this is that thicker cold press. Cold press means that when you're making paper, cold press is where you pull the sheet of pulp and then you just let it dry as is. And so you get all the texture of the paper pulp, of whatever the paper was made out of. Where when hot press is when they basically iron it and it smushes all of these down and you have like a nice flat smooth surface. So some people like the smooth watercolor paper, and some like the coarser cold press paper. But you can see like it's pretty simple to blend. So for one of your remaining assignments, whether it be your independent one, your self-portrait, or the artist-inspired, or if you just want to do extra ones, if you want to get some watercolor paper or some of this ground that you could put on a canvas and experiment with that, you could. But it just gives you that ability to use another type of paint on a surface that you become familiar with. But you can see it looks gorgeous, where this one here, this is still like super wet, like I can still just wipe it right off. But these, I mean, they're on the surface. And then this last one, this was the absorbent ground golden one. You can see the same thing. It works just like paper, and just takes that watercolor or gouache and absorbs it right away. Now, because it's still on canvas, and because these are all acrylic paint brands, they make acrylic too, you can use acrylic on these grounds as well. So it still allows for acrylic usage. So pretty fun stuff. There's also all sorts of other things you can do with watercolor. One thing you can do is add salt while it's wet. So I have a little container here of some salt, and I'm just going to put some I'll put some watercolor here. And then while it's wet, you can put salt on it. And do you see how the color is sort of gravitating to the salt? So it's going to do that. You have to let it dry, and then when you brush it away, you have a similar texture left on your surface. So I've seen a lot of landscape artists and artists that just like to work more non-objective. They'll use some of those techniques to create texture and just different surfaces on their work. So that is the grounds, and using watercolor. So I'm going to just set this back up here. Okay, so I think this has dried enough where I was using the gouache, and now I'm going to try to put some highlights and things and some more details over this. So I'm going to pick up some white gouache, and I see there's kind of a reflection here. I think it still may be a little too wet. It's still bleeding out a little bit. I think it's because I have it taped down to this board. Oh, here, down at the bottom, you can see it's a little bit more dry, but you can see I can even put lines on it and it's not bleeding out. And the gouache, you can get it really thick, so you know, it almost looks three-dimensional, but it will still dry flat usually. But it won't blend as long as the different layers are dry. And here, there was some darker areas, so I've got some black, just kind of putting in. But you can see it's pretty fine, and you don't get that bumpy texture that you get with like acrylic that some of you may have encountered. So there's pros and cons to all the paints, and you really just have to find what works best for you. And I like to use all of them. So for me, it's kind of really what mood I'm in. I feel like I can paint a lot faster with watercolor and gouache, and I sometimes will feel more like working on paper instead of canvas. So it just you have to just kind of go with whatever feels right for you in that moment. But what I really love about those grounds that allows you to work on canvas is that you can use both. Like, so if you like to use watercolor and drawing media and all those things together, you can put that ground on your canvas and use both. And you can see you have the lovely transparency of the watercolor and the more opaque gouache and things like that. So it's pretty fun to put those, and you can start to see that texture coming through with the salt there. Now you may wonder, well, what do I do if I really need an area to stay clean? Like, I don't want to mess it up and get something on it. So there are a lot of resists that you can use that you can put on your paper first to keep the the watercolor or gouache from absorbing, and we call those resist because they resist the absorption of the paint into, or the the paint into the surface. So let's say I wanted a white streak along the side of this glass. I could use like a white crayon, or like if you have like a little tea candle, those work really well also. So you could put the crayon and press down really hard so it seals the surface. Then whenever you go back over it, do you see how it's resisting the water? So you'll always have that white spot in your piece. So some people will go block out all of the white areas, and then that will keep that place nice and neat. Now the crayon's not super easy to be precise with, so they do make some stuff called masking fluid, and it's like a liquid latex you brush on first. So that's pretty fun. And then you can also use rubber cement if you have that on hand as well. So there's a couple of things you can use. If you want to get more abstract, you can use things like toothbrushes that you can, scrape around and create different textures. But then you can also get some of the ink or watercolor in it, and then you can flick it and create almost like a spray paint effect with your watercolor. So there's lots of fun things that you can do with just a simple set of watercolors. And then using the regular brushes, I just wanted to show you how it's pretty much the same thing. You just have to dip them in water. But you can get the same kind of control, except you just have to keep re-wetting your brush. Where those others, you can just squeeze a little bit and it all comes out. All right, so that is how to use the different water media and some of those different brushes and things too. But you can see on this canvas, like all these are dry. So it doesn't take long at all. And like I said, you could keep using more watercolor on it, use acrylic and other things if you're interested. And I don't know how well you could see this up close before when I was demoing it, but this is the gouache, and this was the watercolor. And you can see like this, I mean, you can't see any of the white of the paper through, but in the watercolor, you can see it's like really transparent, which is nice. Like, but there's not one that's better than the other. They just do different things. This is for opaque, and this is for transparent. So they do work, well together. Now, if you buy like a cheaper quality, sometimes you may see some inconsistency, but Winsor & Newton's really good about their pigments being really thick, and so I really like their brand of gouache. All right. So did anybody have any questions about those things?